Okay. Think we're good. Think we're good. Hello. Welcome back. So today, very excited. We're going to be talking about the limbic system, which I think get a lot of questions about. Weirdly enough, and again, I think it's always when you're putting this stuff together. Just strangely, like I was seeing like a lot of posts, especially after I kind of wrote this up. And we're going to go through it. um like a lot of posts of like either about the limbic system or including it. So today we're going to go kind of into a little bit what it is, maybe what you can do to get it working better, and kind of its role in your body. And as we know, it's part of the brain. We'll get into that, but as the nervous system goes, so does the rest of our body. So it's really on us to kind of keep that working. So what is the limbic system? So the limbic system isn't really like one, I guess, structure. It's actually a collection of different structures in the brain that are primarily they're responsible for emotion processing and memory processing. So included in that are things like the hippocampus, the amygdala, hypothalamus. We're going to get into all these a little bit later. Just kind of dive in and learn a little bit about it and what you can do. So kind of the goal. So it's located kind of in the midbrain, in the middle of the brain. It separates what is known as the diencephalon from the cerebral cortex. It's kind of called sometimes the feeling or reactive brain. And like I said, it's responsible for memory formation. So really what it does is it gathers information that comes in from our five senses, from all the stimuli that we are exposed to encounter, and then it basically sorts it into, is it safe or is it unsafe? And then it kind of, distributes it accordingly based and, helps us form whatever reactions kind of come downstream. So that's kind of like what we're doing here with the limbic system. Now, there are a lot of things that can alter the function of it. These include things like infections, trauma of any kind, chemical or mold exposures, inflammation, stress, immune system dysfunction. And this also goes both ways. So, issues with the limbic system can cause some of these, or vice versa. So, it's a two-way street that's kind of really important to kind of understand. So, when it's not functioning properly, the limbic system can become hypersensitive or it can become overactive. And when this happens, we get inappropriate activation of the immune system, of the endocrine system, of the autonomic nervous system, which kind of leads to that stress, fight or flight type response really quick when you don't necessarily, maybe it's not really necessary. It's kind of overactive and it leads to issues down the road. So let's kind of get into like what's going on with it. Now, like I said, those are some functions we went over, but it also regulates the following because of those downstream effects that we'll get into, things like uh, our responses to sensory information. Now, this is particularly important for smell. This is part of the reasons that the limbic system, it certain aromas, certain smells have emotional triggers with us, whether it's like a dish we had when we were growing up as a kid or something else, like certain smells remind us of memories like that. Also important for regulating appetite and eating behaviors, sleep and our ability to dream, our sexual behaviors, emotional responses. It plays a role in addiction and motivation, memory, and social cognition. So we got a lot going on here with the limbic system in terms of what it can do. So let's talk about these structures in it. Start with the amygdala. So the amygdala is kind of like, looks kind of like an almond. It's found in the temporal lobe. Main function is to process emotional responses, including feelings of happiness, anger, fear, anxiety. It's also the key area where new memories are formed in the brain. So it interacts with the hippocampus, excuse me, by attaching emotions to memories. So sometimes we feel certain things when certain memories come up. The amygdala's kind of role in that is to attach that emotion to a memory. It has a role in how memories can be stored. So memories that have strong emotional components tend to stick compared to ones that don't. So the ones that have stronger emotional triggers tend to stick with you longer, and we all have examples of that. So like I remember still crystal clear because I'm from New York City. I remember on 9/11, the exact things that happened that morning in my fourth grade class. I remember where I went. I remember, seeing everything, but I could not tell you what happened the day before or after in terms of like what I did or how my day was. But I do remember that. And that's, 20 years ago at this point. So things like that. And that had a strong, emotional connection. So that's kind of what the amygdala does. So it also, though, is responsible for fear learning. Now, this is important and particularly important in today's environment. So, fearful memories can be formed after only a few repetitions. So it allows you to, and then from that, when that fear emotion is triggered, you're going to avoid that stimulus. Now, we've all seen this to varying degrees over the past couple years, how fear can be used to trigger certain emotions, trigger certain responses kind of as we go. So, really key tool that I think is used by the mainstream media. And this is kind of that pathway that it's taking advantage of. So, in that way, the amygdala is connected to the fight or flight response. So, stimulating it, especially through that fear learning technique, can stimulate that sympathetic fight or flight response. Now, damage to the amygdala, if it's impaired in some way, can lead to aggression, irritability, loss of control of emotions, deficits in recognizing emotions, and especially recognizing fear. So, when there's damage to it, those kind of fear centers are not responding appropriately. So, important to know. Next is the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is more focused on the memory formation than the emotion part. This is why the hippocampus and the amygdala have kind of an important interconnected relationship. One brings more of the emotional side of things. One brings the more just memory of a situation, and kind of together they form memories kind of as we see them fit over time. So episodic memories are formed in the hippocampus and then they're filed away into like a long-term storage, usually in some other part of the cerebral cortex. Now, the hippocampus also has a role in spatial navigation and has also been associated with learning and emotions. So, where we are in space and time, kind of spatial awareness, that's the hippocampus. That's going to be playing a role with that. Also, the hippocampus is where neurogenesis occurs. So you can literally create new nerve cells where it's done, or adult stem cells turn into new nerve cells in the hippocampus. So that's where that's done. That's where neurogenesis occurs in the brain. It's primarily in the hippocampus. So because the hippocampus is involved in memory, if it's damaged, it quite logically, it would lead to some sort of memory impairments. So if there's damage to the hippocampus, could affect spatial memory, remembering locations or directions to locations that, should be familiar. That's something that's sort of like key, or something that's a red flag when it comes to hippocampus damage. If you can't remember where you used to go to a place that you went all the time, that's a sign of damage to the hippocampus. Then there's the parahippocampal gyrus. Now, this is the membrane that surrounds the hippocampus. It also plays a role in memory formation. There's the cingulate gyrus, which is above the corpus callosum, and it's involved in a bunch of different aspects of emotions and memory. So it's thought to regulate emotions, behavior, pain, as well as being responsible for autonomic motor function. So, those automatic, how our organs are working, that's where the cingulate gyrus is thought to play a role in making sure that autonomic nervous system, we're finding that balance between sympathetic, parasympathetic, and that it's doing its thing. It also can be involved in fear and the prediction and avoidance of negative stimuli. So again, it kind of has that interplay with the amygdala that we were talking about. So, in that way. So that's where the cingulate gyrus comes in. If it's damaged, it can result in inappropriate emotions or having a lack of fear, or sometimes an impaired sense of pain, either too much pain, a hyper sense of pain, or in heightened sense of pain, or no pain at all. It also can lead to learning impairments. So also they found if there's um, damage or differences in the shape of the cingulate gyrus, it is associated with things like autism, depression, OCD, post traumatic stress disorder, bipolar, other things. A couple other kind of smaller parts are things like septal nuclei that connect different limbic structures. They're important for the pleasure reward systems in the body. There are mammillary bodies, which are two groups of nuclei that play a large role in memory and have a lot of connections with both the hippocampus and the amygdala. Then we have the basal ganglia and the hippocampus. So the basal ganglia, it's kind of a group of structures that sit kind of at the bottom end of the forebrain and kind of on top of the midbrain. Its functions, they regulate voluntary movement, including eye movements. They also help with posture and balance. So that's where the basal ganglia comes in. When these areas, it's also involved in cognitive and emotional behaviors, particularly in the reward system. So this is where things like dopamine and serotonin come in that are very important in the basal ganglia. It's kind of that it plays a role in the reward center of the brain. Because of this, the basal ganglia is usually the part of the brain that's associated with addictive behavior and the formations of habits. So your ability to form habits or create addictive behaviors, that's going to come in the basal ganglia. When there is damage to the basal ganglia, it can result in tremors or involuntary muscle movements. Now, remember, the basal ganglia kind of helps regulate those. It could also mean abnormal posture, links to movement disorders. So think like Huntington's or Parkinson's. Those have a connection to the basal ganglia. Finally, the another part that kind of connects the brain and the nervous system to the endocrine system and the rest of the body is actually the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is really important because it controls hormone release through the anterior pituitary gland. And we've talked about the pituitary gland before, but the hypothalamus is basically what controls the anterior pituitary gland function. And the hypothalamus is really the part of the brain that connects the endocrine system and the nervous system. So, the nervous system, if had to make, a analogy, the nervous system is the immediate. I'm able to move my hand, I'm able to turn my head pretty much immediately when I have that thought to do so. The endocrine system is run on hormones, and while their effects are not necessarily as immediate, they tend to last longer and to be more widespread. They affect more areas of the brain and the entire body, but they don't have that instantaneous reaction that you get with the nervous system. So that's kind of the difference between the two. But the hypothalamus is basically the bridge between the two. So because of that, it also is important for controlling things like hunger and thirst, body temperature, blood pressure, heart rate, sexual activity, anything that hormones are related to. They're going to start somewhere around the hypothalamus to get triggered to either start the production of hormones or stop them in some way based on what the body needs. It's basically to help the body maintain homeostasis. So if there is impairment of the hypothalamus, it could lead to things like aggressive behavior, feeling super stressed out of or out of energy, so fatigue, feeling hot or cold, weight gain or weight loss, or issues doing that, either being hyperactive or underactive. It could affect your sex drive, and it also can affect mood. So things like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, and even schizophrenia is linked to damage to the hypothalamus. So the limbic system, because of this, as I hope I've made clear, does affect the entire body. So issues in the limbic system are going to have downstream effects from everything from things like epilepsy to dementia, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, affective disorders, ADHD, autism, fatigue syndromes, panic attacks, adrenal fatigue is a huge one, POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, IBS, gut issues. All of these can somehow be related to the limbic system because of all those different functions and the connection between the nervous system and the endocrine system. Now, what are things that can affect the limbic system or cause dysfunction in the limbic system? They're going to be things like Infections, whether they're viral, bacterial, fungal in origin, trauma, physical trauma, psychological trauma, emotional trauma, chemical exposures. We're going to get into that a little bit. Mold toxicity, inflammation, chronic stress, and then immune system dysfunction, which again goes back to kind of that gut health. So all of these things can affect it one way or another. Um, so damage to these areas is going to cause issues in a variety of different ways. So kind of important to kind of keep that in mind. So, when there's damage to the limbic system, it leads us to a state of high alert, fight or flight, put us in that stress state. It tamps down our brain tamps down on our regulatory body systems, including the immune system and detox pathways, because that is not the priority when we are sympathetic dominant. It's basically survival mode. So, the immune system, the detox pathways, those are kind of put on the back burner because our body kind of perceives, hey, we have, an immediate problem that we need to take care of. That stuff might, do us harm, but it's not going to do us harm right now. It's going to take a little bit longer. So that is where this kind of comes in. Now it comes to, of course, how do we make improvements here? Now, obviously, listen, we're on my channel here. It's all connected. Yes, everything causes everything. So we got to talk about solutions, right? Like, how are we going to actually make improvements? Now, with me here, food is always going to be kind of the forefront or one of the primary things that we have to work with. So that's naturally where I like to start. So our food choices are going to matter. Incorporating more anti-inflammatory foods, more whole foods that are going to limit inflammation in the brain are going to be key. On top of that, stabilizing blood sugar, which we know is inflammatory if we get into a state where we're in some sort of insulin sensitive state or type 2 diabetes. This massively raises the level of inflammation in the body. So stabilizing blood sugar, reducing inflammation. And to do both of those, the fastest way to do it is going to be to increase fiber intake from real foods, not some sort of fiber supplement. So that's going to be the fastest way to do that. It's also going to help maintain and optimize the microbiome, which we're going to talk a little bit about later. So what does that mean? More high fiber foods, your garlic and onions, your artichokes, asparagus, ginger, beans are huge. I know that's a big thing. I've talked about beans all the time, but that's one thing I think people like really, really need to start getting more of, because in some ways they are the food most associated with longevity more than any other food. Berries, a variety of fruits, ideally all fruits, they are going to help stabilize blood sugar long term. It's important to understand that. What's more important with all this usually are the things that we have to take out or causing the issues. So high amounts of caffeine over time, that's going to lead to that adrenal fatigue, adrenal overload, and then eventually lead to fatigue. Going to be a big issue. Refined sugars, processed grains, processed sugars, these are going to be huge. These are probably the main cause of those glucose spikes, those insulin spikes to begin with. We have to replace those with real foods. Even though they're sweeter, they're going to help stabilize that curve over time. Now, it's not going to happen overnight, but even replacing those with fruit, with higher fiber foods, with a lot of veggies, beans, etc., those things are going to make a huge, huge difference when it comes to bringing down the level of inflammation and also stabilizing blood sugar. Other things that are going to affect the gut are things like preservatives and food additives that are going to be terrible for the gut. Think things like glyphosate, genetically modified foods, pesticides, toxins. These can lead to issues in the gut where you get proteins that are able to kind of break through because there's a leaky gut type of situation. When you have that, the immune system's going to get affected. And again, you're starting to see how everything affects everything and everything is connected in some way. So a good place to always start with this stuff is to, start in the gut and address that. And generally, you're going to get good effects kind of coming back from that. On top of that, things you might want to stay away from are conventional meat and dairy, especially because, again, you're dealing with the issues with potential GMOs, additives, preservatives. but then you're adding the exogenous antibiotic and added hormone effects that are going to basically compound those. Big issues. Farm fished, processed foods, hydrogenated fats that are rancid, processed vegetable oils. All of these things are going to be the things you're probably going to want to take out and replace those with what I was talking about earlier. Another thing that would be important is optimizing our omega 6, 3, and 6 fatty acid ratios. So we need to have that balance between omega 3s and 6s. The omega 3s tend to be more anti-inflammatory, and that tends to be where we lack. But what I also see is we tend to not decrease the amount of omega 6 fatty acids. So we need to basically get closer to a one-to-one balance as possible. Now, the best places to find omega 3s are going to be things like in sea veggies, algae oils are great for those who are plant-based, chia seeds, flax seeds, walnuts. If you are going to use fish, you really want to make sure it's wild caught, but salmon, sardines are also good choices too. Stress is also going to be a big thing because, again, that fight or flight response kind of goes both ways. So important to kind of keep that in mind. Um, with that being said, severe stress causes inflammation in the brain. That inflammation could then trigger issues with the hippocampus. And again, you get those downstream effects. So, stress again goes both ways here. Really important to kind of keep that in mind. So, some techniques you can use to manage stress are going to be things like prayer and meditation, grounding, deep breathing exercises. Are you getting sunlight in your eyes, particularly in the morning and at evening and in the middle of the day? Honestly, throughout the day, getting exposure to those natural EMFs are going to help regulate our circadian rhythm, sleep cycle, which is going to affect melatonin. And we're going to get into sleep in a little bit too. But Epsom salt baths, really good, particularly if there's a magnesium deficiency, which is a big thing to kind of watch out for with stuff like this. Uh, Dry brushing, gratitude and laughter. So actually just showing gratitude, whether it's through a meditation practice, journaling, it actually releases hormones like oxytocin and serotonin that put our mind and body in a more positive state, which leads to a better response, limbic response. Laughter also does a similar thing because it will help release endorphins, which stimulate a more positive outlook and outcome. And when we are in a more positive frame of mind, that actually gives us an immune system response too. So again, everything affects everything to some degree. Chronic infections. Sorry. One more thing I wanted to get to. Other things you can do to help relieve stress. I really think like if you can find some sort of hobby or play a game, whether it's a recreational sport. Do you like reading books? Do you have an active hobby where you're using your hands or feet? Maybe it's quitting or nilting. Maybe it's painting, quilting or knitting. Quitting or nilting. Quilting or knitting. Some kind of art. So, do you like painting? Do you like drawing? uh, Listening to music, all of these things are really, really helpful. Next, we get to things like chronic infections. These are huge. So, our gut and brain are directly connected, primarily through the vagus nerve. If there is a gut infection, whether it's viral, parasitic, a bacterial overgrowth, these things have to be addressed. You could get them tested through something like a GI stool test. You could do it through muscle testing. You could even get some information from a comprehensive blood analysis or like a CBC. There's something known as a comprehensive viral panel. If you want to find out if there's a virus, you get some objective information with that too. And then really it's going to be about, testing those appropriately. If there's an infection that's going to affect the integrity of the gut lining, digestion, immune system response, and the overall level of inflammation in the body. So if you have those, that's going to be something that needs to be addressed. Mold is a huge one too. So mold toxicity occurs when you're exposed to mycotoxins, which are produced by mold, and this could lead to a state of chronic inflammation. If there is chronic damage due to mold, it can lead to an inflammatory response, and this can damage the limbic system. So, if you live, and this is very important, so I want to make this clear. If you live in a place where there is mold, Well, let me rephrase that. If you live in a place where there is water damage, then you live in a place where there is mold, period. So if there is water damage somewhere, you can almost guarantee that there is some sort of mold going on. So, and that if that is in the place you live, if that's a place you work, that's something that, has to be addressed one way or another. So, really important to kind of keep that, in mind. So, you can test for mold toxicity. You can do a mycotoxin test, which is a urine test. So, you could kind of screen for it in that way. So, really important to kind of check for that. You could also look into maybe some binders and stuff to help with that too, whether there's some environmental toxins. You could talk with me about that, work with me on that. I'm more than happy to help to get, some good ones if that's something you're interested in. Another big one is EMFs, especially now, and it's only going to become more. And I see the irony in that because I'm in front of a computer screen and a phone at the same time. But important to keep that in mind. So sensitivity to EMFs can play a role in limbic system dysfunction. So an EMF is essentially just a field. It's an electromagnetic field that produces an electric charge that's sent out into space, right? And there are also natural electromagnetic fields. So us as humans, we're water-based beings. We have an electromagnetic frequency that we give off, and we interact with frequencies all over where we live. Nature, sunlight, looking at different colors. Each color has a different vibrational frequency. Everything, it comes down to frequency at the end of the day. Now, there's some non-native EMFs, things that do not naturally occur that can cause issues, and they might come from things like microwaves, cell phones, computers, Wi-Fi routers, tablets, Bluetooth devices, could be power lines, house energy meters, things like smart meters, MRIs, and then you have ionizing radiation, which are things like UV light exposure or X-rays, things like X-rays. So there's a lot of different things. Like, listen, there is no way we can completely get rid of non-native EMFs at this point in the modern world. The best we can do is try to reduce our exposure as best we can. You can use something like a Somavedic machine. You could check that out on my website, insideouthealthwellness.com, if you want a discount there. You can shut off your Wi-Fi router at night. I keep right here. I know this is not great for listening, but I have things like shungite bracelets that I wear most of the time that are helpful. There are definitely other things you can do when it comes to cell phones and stuff like that too. So, being proactive about that stuff is really important if you can. I shut my airplane. I put airplane mode on my phone at night. So there are always things you can do to limit it. It's going to be impossible to get rid of all of it, but it's something worth being aware of. Toxin exposure is also a big thing, environmental toxins. So we touched on this earlier. This comes down to the food we eat, whether it's things like glyphosate, pesticides, herbicides that are going to disrupt your gut microbiome in some way. Uh, Products we use. So personal care products, household cleaners, medications, heavy metals, silver fillings are a big thing. Heavy metals from other appliances that we use on a regular basis. Are you cooking with Teflon pans? You got to get rid of those. Smoke, mold that we talked about. All of these are going to affect your brain in some way. Heavy metals are particularly tricky because some of them can get they have an affinity for fatty or tissue, which is most of our nervous system, right? So particularly our brain is primarily made of fat. So, you know, heavy metals tend to have an affinity for that. So can we get rid of that? Can we detox from that? Again, there are binders and things you can use. But there's usually a bigger thing that, we kind of have to get into with that because you have to make sure those detox pathways are open. Are we detoxifying properly so we don't have reactions kind of in the interim? That's a separate thing. Um, what else do we have here? So we want to make sure those detoxification pathways are open properly. Are you going number two to three times per day? Are we urinating on a regular basis? Are you going? Do you know how to diaphragmatic breathe? Breath work is huge here. Most of our detoxification actually comes through the breath. About 70% of toxins are generally excreted through the breath. That's the constant exchange we have with the lungs. And then obviously supporting the liver the way we can. Another big thing, obviously, is sleep. So a lack of sleep is going to significantly impact our ability to function cognitively. That's going to be a big issue. So making sure we're getting enough sleep is going to be a big thing. One of the toxins that we know are associated with issues in the brain are something known as beta amyloid plaques. So we notice that when there's an accumulation of these, there tend to be issues with the brain. This particular one is usually associated with something like called Alzheimer's. So something to kind of keep in mind. But sleep, getting proper sleep is crucial, particularly for the neurological system, but also our detox pathways. But for our neurology, it's really important because it actually upregulates neurotransmitter production and helps actually rebuild and repair myelin sheaths that insulate our nerves and allow for more nerve conduction. So there are some sleep aids that can be useful. I'm not going to go too far into them now because this is running a little long, but things like melatonin, valerian, passion flower, magnesium, we mentioned, 5-hydroxytryptophan or 5-HTP, which is a serotonin precursor. Other herbs like ashwagandha, lemon balm, lavender, valerian's really good. I think I mentioned that. Yeah. All those are going to be really helpful too. Um, the last couple things that are really useful that kind of go hand in hand. One is daily movement. So one of the best ways to train the brain is to just literally move your body in a variety of different um, motions. Full ranges of motion if possible, just to train those, build that coordination. Could start with things like cross crawl patterns. And then obviously, there's more sports specific stuff, things like that. Really, really helpful. But getting moving, doing something in some way, it also helps increase blood flow to the brain. When you get your heart pumping, you're going to get more blood to your brain, which is really important too. There's also something called limbic retraining. So this is based on the concept of neuroplasticity, which is the ability of the brain to change form and form new neural networks. So new connections between neurons in the brain, which is really, really cool. It's a fairly new concept because it was thought that this was something that was pretty much fixed basically after infancy, but turns out we can actually retrain and actually rewire our brain based doing a lot of the things we talked about. So really, really cool stuff. There's some systems out there like the Gupta amygdala retraining program. There's DNRS, which is dynamic neural retraining system. You could look into that. There's things like Buteyko breathing, which is something that I'm about to start and actually offer to people. So there's a lot of different things you can do there. So I know this was a lot. I keep saying these are going to be 10 to 15 minutes. They end up being a half hour, so I'm going to have to cut them. But I hope this was helpful. A lot of different things you can do, a lot of different things you kind of jump into, but where someone starts is going to be different for everyone. I'd be more than happy to help anyone with them on that journey. You can feel free to reach out to me. You can either shoot me a DM or schedule a consult on my website, insideouthealthwellness.com. More than happy to help on a more, personal level if possible. So thank you for tuning in here on YouTube. I'll check you out later. This will be posted there. I'll see you guys next week. Much love. Okay.